Hello, my name is Bryan Klein. I am the CRRT nurse educator for adult ICUs at Chandler, and I am narrating the recap for the CRRT SuperUser 2022. This is specifically geared for the E-ICU staff. Hopefully we'll be able to discuss some things that will allow you to be better resources for the bedside staff and allow them to utilize your services better and more efficiently. You can listen to this as sort of podcast style, or you can follow along with the slides that will be available to you, however you want to do it. I'm anticipating this will probably take about half an hour, so it's going to be obviously very condensed compared to the actual SuperUser courses, but hopefully this will be very focused and exactly what you need. The course outline for the CRRT SuperUser class, we have, of course, some nursing updates and reminders that are going to be the most important for you. The troubleshooting and documentation will also be a good focus for you all. While we had the in-person classes, we had lectures by Juan Carlos Asenina and Paul Adams, both nephrology physicians, some pharmacotherapeutic considerations by Dr. Melissa Thompson-Baston, and of course physical and occupational therapy with Tim Lin, DP, PT, DPT. Quality improvement, I'm going to roll into this more or less, but Rob Dorfman originally presented that content, and Amy Butler from Baxter Corporation came in. And we also had a very fun Jeopardy game. I wish that you all could have been part of that. And we will basically kind of cover that in this short time. So by the end of the course, the nurses were asked to be able to correctly identify the structure and function of all the major components on the Prismaflex CRRT machine. We call them the body parts. If you know which part you're looking at that needs to be fixed, you can more quickly identify and troubleshoot the problem that you have. State actions to take to optimize pharmacotherapeutics while on CRRT, perform basic to intermediate troubleshooting maneuvers, demonstrate how to enhance mobility while on CRRT, explain function and purpose of quality improvement initiatives, demonstrate correct CRRT documentation, and state the resources that are available for CRRT at UK Healthcare. So general updates for 2022. These are probably well disseminated by now, but the machine order form in Epic is new. The CRRT order set received a small update, as well as the E-Fluent test order. The nurses are reminded to roll the CRRT machines to the service elevators on the 200 side if they're in Pavilion A. Good Samaritan has a different procedure. And then to remember to place pickup orders through Epic to ensure prompt service. We also briefly discussed the return of Prismaflex to Good Samaritan. So if you're just listening to the presentation, just make sure to come back to this. The new order in Epic is just called CRRT machine. It's got a little light bulb next to it if you're a nurse entering the order. It will ask you whether it's delivery or pickup, and there's a box to specify what the location is. So if you're asking it to be delivered to, say, room 9138, or pickup, you might say service elevators. It will also ask the type of CRRT machine, either Prismaflex or Prismax. Prismaflex at Good Samaritan ICU, and Prismax in Chandler Adult ICUs. Quantity is always 1. The blood leak detected procedure is more or less the same, but the order has finally been built out to properly reflect the fluid. The order is called Body Fluid Cell Count with Differential. Best ordered as stat. The body fluid will be selected as specimen type, and effluent fluid will be the specimen source. Previously, there was no option for effluent fluid. When this order is put in, it will ask the nurse to collect it in a sterile container, and the goal is to have 0 under the red blood cell count and results. If it's anything other than 0, the nurse has to take down the set and not return the blood because it's considered contaminated, but if it is 0, they can normalize the blood leak detector. This slide is just an example of what the results will look like on a quote-unquote clean effluent test. You can see that the red blood cell count says 0. Typically this takes 45 minutes to 2 hours, and the nurses are allowed to continue to run CRRT in the meantime. Obviously, if they see blood in the effluent bag, they don't need to run this test. They can just take the set down and not return the blood. We don't often see scuff used as a mode of therapy, but that doesn't mean that it's completely gone. When patients are on scuff, they're typically fluid overloaded with no significant renal impairment. However, we know from experience that many of these patients will unfortunately move on to need a higher mode of therapy like CVV-HDF. So we recommend that the nurses always set up the machines in CVV-HDF. That way every line is primed on the white, green, and purple pumps. If it is scuff and there's nothing ordered for those lines, you can just use saline to prime the lines. Baxter does recommend a post-filter replacement fluid added to scuff, a minimum of 500 mils per hour, and this just is to assist the machine in not having clots form in the deaeration chamber. Usually I see Foxillum 4 2.5 ordered for scuff. Obviously this is physician ordered. And if the nurse is unsure, you can always look up the nephrology provider on call and clarify that with them. ICON, of course, is available 24/7 at 1-888-404-4266. They're available for nurses, but they also have a pharmacist and a physician on call 24/7. So if the provider is unsure or uncomfortable with ordering scuff, they can assist them in that. In 2022, we made a very slight change to the CRRT order set from setup mode to run mode. This was done specifically to cover nurses who did not feel comfortable on their licenses setting up the machine in CVV-HDF when the order said setup mode of scuff. So you can now set up the machine in whatever mode you need to. We recommend CVV-HDF, and to put at least 10 mLs per hour on all lines. That would be white, green, and purple. What this does is this ensures that the line is primed and ready to go, so that if you do have to go from scuff to CVV-HDF, that line is primed and it won't give you an error and refuse to do that. Another final reminder, the Prismaflex returned to Good Samaritan ICU at the very end of 2022. This decision was made in order to better utilize the equipment that we had purchased for UK and to standardize care given a certain area. The green machine, there are, I believe, 5 of them housed at Good Samaritan ICU, and they've moved the 5 gray machines that have been allocated them over to Chandler. Some things that are a little bit different, especially if you're used to using the new gray machine and you're going back to the old green machine, the heating cable is in place of the Thermax. It's called a Thermaflow. It's not nearly as efficient as the Thermax is, so we recommend that nurses, as a matter of procedure, just grab a bear hugger because they're probably going to need that external heating. Effluent disposal has to be done manually. There's no auto effluent drain. They can set up an IV pole with some suction tubing and put it in the toilet in the patient's hospital room. Obviously, the family cannot use the toilet if this setup is made, or they can walk it down to a hopper and use that disposal. Since there's a pretty high risk of cross-contamination and spills, we do recommend the former practice. There's no PFR or patient fluid removal makeup on the Prismaflex, so this means that every time that the therapy pumps are paused to change bags, this does result in loss of prescription. So the changing of bags needs to be done extra promptly on the green machine. This is not an emergent concern, but it is an urgent concern. You want to make sure that your therapy pumps are running. The Flex can be set up outside the room when it's plugged in, and you can unplug it and roll it in, but you can't run therapy. There's no battery life to actually run the pumps. And then all the documentation and support should be exactly the same from there on out. So those are some very minor differences, but they do make a difference when you are practicing. Every piece of information that we make for new hires and for continuing stuff, we usually put on the SharePoint. So the entire new user presentation, which is like 90 slides, is available. It's on https://luky.sharepoint.com/sites/CRRT, and that's kind of a mouthful. So most people just go in through their Outlook email and search for the CRRT SharePoint. They're under documents, and the documentation resources are specifically there. We also put announcements. Can't overstate this enough. It has got all the good stuff on it. Couple reminders. Every spring and fall, we have daylight savings time, and the Prismaflex and the Prismax tend to lose a couple minutes when they're unplugged anyway, when they're in storage. So we make it a matter of habit to always go into the settings before you start somebody on therapy and make sure the date and time are correct. For the Prismax, what that looks like is hitting System. The Flex will actually prompt you for it, which was pretty nice. We also, for the Prismax, you'll have to enter you'll change operator to site expert in the top right. The default password is 135246, or it's 0 6 times if the machine has been somehow reset to factory conditions. On the top left-hand side, you'll see a display. You'll tap it once to open the menu and tap a second time to get to date and time. And the user has to press apply underneath the date and time in this setting. Otherwise, it will not save it. So they can hit accept in the bottom right after that, but they have to hit apply. We also recommend that the user sets it 5 minutes into the future to assist in charting, since Epic can never chart in the future and we want people to be able to do timely documentation. Auto enter not working is a pretty major inconvenience, but it won't actually affect your therapy. Some common troubleshooting for that is to make sure that the Ethernet is plugged into the adapter in the back of the machine and not the Ethernet port. The data is not usable to Epic if it's directly into the Ethernet port. The date and time need to be correct, or auto enter is not going to work, and the MRN, of course, needs to be correct. If all that is in place and it's still not working, they or you can call 38586, which is the IT help desk, to submit a ticket, but they can't really do anything while they're on therapy. If you have a really sick, unstable CRRT patient, or you have a paired CRRT patient and you are just not able to get in there every hour to get your all 16 of those numbers, we usually prioritize charting flow rates and hourly pressures as the #1 priority. For broken machines, step 1 should always be to call ICON. Even if you don't think that they'll be able to fix the problem, at least they will have a record of it with Baxter, and with enough records they can fix software issues. Step 2 should be to red tag the machine with a brief description of the problem. Doesn't need to be super long, just should say more than broke. And step 3 is to call it in. This is very important. Again, the help desk is 38586. They will need the Crothel ID for that. That's located on the right side of the machine with a little barcode on it. And then, of course, putting in a new order in Epic to switch it out and then bring in the new machine. All right, basic troubleshooting for both the Prismax and the these will be the same. Access and return issues are the most common, but they're usually the easiest for the bedside nurse to figure out. Flushing the catheters, making sure that nothing is kinked or clamped, reversing the ports, and if necessary, taking down the sterile dressing and rotating the catheter 180 degrees can all help with flow problems. We use Alteplase only as a last resort. We usually actually recommend that the line be changed before Alteplase be used. Fluid being removed at unexpected rate. This is basically the scale for any one of the scales is detecting that the bag is too heavy or too light from what it expects. So the #1 cause for this is actually somebody's got a EKG catheter, or one of the lines is just hanging on the scale, so it makes it feel heavier. But lately we've noticed that when auto effluent bags are leaking, this will make the yellow scale feel lighter than it needs to be, and that's actually because it's losing fluid, and this becomes a problem because then the effluent pump has to spin faster and it pulls off far more fluid from the patient than actually is intended, and people can get hypotensive and hypovolemic. So if you've got a leaking auto effluent set, this needs to be changed, not patched. Air in line is most common when somebody forgets to break open that top compartment of their Foxillum bag, that 250 ml thing. Sometimes it can happen with accidental disconnects, but that's pretty rare, thankfully. This has to be troubleshooted with the Prismax with a blue or green dialysis clamp, or if they don't have that available, they can wrap some tape around a hemostat. This should not be standard practice, hopefully. With the Flex, it's going to be similar, except they don't need to clamp anything because there's no Thermax being used. So the on-screen instructions are pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of having the presence of mind and calmness to actually follow them, which can be stressful. Blood leak detected, we kind of really talked about that in that previous slide. Return blood temperature low is for the Thermax only, so for the Prismax machine. This is almost never a clinically actionable alarm outside of just getting a bear hugger. Sometimes nurses will reflexively disable the Thermax, and that actually makes the hypothermia worse because now it's not getting any heating at all. This is usually common with high post-filter replacement rates because that fluid is being added into the circuit at a point after the heater. So bear hugger is going to be your number one go-to on that. Thermax nut level also only relevant for the Prismax. This isn't very common anymore though because they made it less sensitive. Just moving the machine and raising and lowering the Thermax usually resolves that. This last one is important. Preventative maintenance overdue. This is not a clinically actionable item. There's no need to return the machine. They're serviced periodically. If the nurse calls ICON or if you call ICON, they will tell you the exact same thing. They can just hit override and it will be done on a rotation schedule. So a lot of delays can happen if we're waiting for a new machine when there's not anything wrong with the old one. Okay, documentation. This is probably our most commonly requested education point. The standard for documentation is to chart in more or less real time, hour per hour. It's one of those things where if you have a really busy patient, it can get out of your way, but I would for sure prioritize charting CRRT over, say, assessment data. We usually encourage our new nurses, at least in the medicine ICU, to prioritize charting your vitals, your I's and O's, and your CRRT numbers pretty much in real time because it's all pretty quick, and then you can go back and chart all your assessment data as necessary. Documentation is important to determine basically quality improvement metrics, billing, and of course calculate the correct amount of ultrafiltrate to remove. So on the CRRT flow sheet, you're going to start off and kind of go down the column, and basically everything's just Q1 hour charting, and it goes by pretty quickly. Demonstrate. So fluid removal is very important because it is probably the number one metric that we can affect as nurses for survivability. So people who come in who are overloaded, I think I read a paper the other day that they die about 3 times more frequently than people who are not fluid overloaded once they survive their initial insult. It also can help get you off mechanical ventilation earlier, which results in a shorter length of stay and makes you a little bit more likely to recover your native renal function. So the components of fluid balance are patient intake, which is all forms of intake added together, and total output, which is all forms of output added together, which does include CRRT. It makes that calculation for you. You don't need to do that. The patient balance is basically a number that says if this patient were not on CRRT, what is their balance? So if they have 100 of tube feed, drip rates, free water, that kind of stuff coming in, and they're only putting 10 out on their Foley, they have a patient balance of 90. CRRT fluid removal is added back in by the flow sheet to make this calculation just so it's not double counted, but it's not something that the bedside nurse has to worry about. Deficit from prior hour is whatever you did not get off from your goal last hour, or if you got too much off, you'll have a negative deficit. Deficit always refers to from respect of the prescription, not from the patient. So if I was supposed to get off 100 and I really got off 50, that's a 50 ml deficit. Now, if I was supposed to get off 100 and I got off 150, that's a 50 ml surplus, which is less common, but usually that would just show up as a negative 50 deficit. Actual fluid removal is the same thing as patient fluid removal, or PFR. It's what the machine pulled off. It uses patient balance plus the deficit to calculate an actual balance, and then it will add in the actual balance plus the goal that you've programmed to make a suggested fluid removal. So how do you actually do this in Epic? Well, I say it's easy as 1, 2, 3. The only problem is step 3 has a lot of sub-steps, but quickly when you're used to it. So step 1, vitals. This is just a reminder that you gotta do Q1 hour charting when you have any sort of external heating or cooling device per policy at UK. They can do this on the complex vitals flow sheet, or they can do the I know with the vitals to make it faster. It's whatever they want to do. Step 2 is to clear the pumps, is the best. The reason for physically clearing the pumps is that the calculation that Epic will make is dependent on the prescription being exactly correct in the pump and the Epic order, which they frequently are not. And it's also dependent on any titrations being charted in real time, which is sometimes challenging to do. So we always recommend that the gold standard is to clear the pumps and write that amount down. If you are the first person to care for a CRRT patient, you'll probably have to add the CRRT intake and output rows in the INO flow sheet. And again, this only works on the INO with vitals flow sheet, which should be the default template for anybody in ICU. Remember, returning blood is considered a net intake because you are gaining net fluid, and I can give you a discussion for that if you have any questions on an individual basis. Moving along, charting the I's and O's, you can kind of see in the PowerPoint right here that the volume that it suggests may or may not be the same as what the actual pump gives you as an output. The kind of rule of thumb is if you are dead set on using the calculator function of Epic, it should match within 1 milliliter of what your pump actually gives you. If it's any more than that, that 1 ml difference or 2 ml difference times 72, 96 hours can really add up to some pretty big discrepancies. As a reminder, if you have multiple KVOs, you can add them together in the IV line. You can just say 57 plus 10 plus 5, and Epic will do that math for you. So no need to have your personal calculator out. And your citrate or ACDA intake should always be charted as 0 because it's not delivered to the patient. Some people get around that by just unchecking include volume, and that works, but it runs the risk that somebody's going to forget to do that and it will chart a very large intake that did not happen. All right, so now moving on to the CRRT flow sheet. So this is step 3. Notice that step 3 is dependent on steps 1 and 2 already being done. So if any part of those are not done, you have to go back and chart it before you can do step 3. So the very top treatment is going to be CVV-HDF, whether it's continuous or if it's off, anything like that, and which your filter type is. So what you see on the screen is what you're going to chart a vast majority of the time. Step 3B is you're going to select your UF goal, and this should match your prescription. So if your prescription says net negative 200 an hour and you're not pulling anything, that means you are running off your prescription. So best practice would be to contact nephrology if this is going to persist for a while and say we need to update our UF goal because it's not realistic for me to pull UF on a patient who is on 4 pressors maxed, something like that. Likewise, if you tell it that my UF goal is negative 50 an hour and you're pulling 5 an hour, it's going to generate a running deficit of 45 every hour. So you want to set a goal that you're actually trying to achieve. Next, you're going to select the net negative value. So if they say net negative 100 to 200, you would select somewhere within that, and you never put a negative sign in front. You're just going to put a single number. So if my patient's doing really well, they're not hypotensive, they're not tachycardic, they're not going up on pressors, I might pull towards the more aggressive end of that range. Whereas if they are kind of, going up very, very slowly on their pressors, I might stay with a more conservative, stay to the lower end of that. Next, the only thing that you're going to have to pull from your sidebar summary is your total intake and total output for that hour, which, as you can see on the sidebar here, are neatly summarized by that little gray bar. These are the only 2 numbers that need to be pulled into the CRRT flow sheet that don't do automatically. If there's a double dash in any one of those columns, that indicates a null value was entered on the INO flow sheet, which basically means it did not receive data. So that might be an indicator, oh hey, I forgot to chart my LEVO intake. So that would be a reminder to stop what you're doing, delete what you have on this flow sheet, and go back to your I's and O's, fix that, come back to your CRRT flow sheet, and you might need to refresh the sidebar summary with the little green refresh thing on the top. This is just an up-close view of what that sidebar summary looks like, and you're going to want to select hourly intake and output, not INO and results. INO and results will give you Q8 hour I's and O's and lab results, which you don't need for this. So the flow sheet will auto-calculate the patient balance, the deficit from prior hour, and it's going to generate a suggested fluid removal for the next hour based on that information. The CRRT actual fluid removal transposes from the previous flow sheet, so they do not chart that on this flow sheet. And that information is in the sidebar summary if you care to look. After that, nurse maintenance and machine parameters are pretty straightforward. You're just going to chart the machine number. You're going to verify that there's no clots in the deaeration chamber, verify that the blood is at the appropriate level. For the green Prismaflex, it's a return line heating sleeve. For the gray Prismax, it's a fluid warmer if they're using the Thermax. And then whatever they've set the fluid temperature setting for. So 36 degrees would go, of course, with the Thermax, whereas the ThermaFlow for the green machine usually is 43 degrees. And then all the machine parameters should auto-enter. You'll just have to have the data validate right there. So for those of you who like colors, this slide right here demonstrates that anything in red is something that you are going to select based on your goal. Anything as green is going to be pulled from the I&O summary in the sidebar, and anything that's blue is going to be calculated by the flow sheet. A good way to double check yourself as you go through CRRT is to go to the summary tab on the top and go to intake and output, view by calendar days, and that daily net should start to show negative values as you progress on pulling fluid off your CRRT patient. Now there is a feature from a couple slides called override actual balance. That was one of the red boxes that was blank, and normally it will be blank, but there are times when we have to account for fluid that we have given or taken away, but we don't want it included in the CRRT calculations. So case number 1 here is patient dropped their hemoglobin from 7.1 the day before to 6.9 today. We give 1 unit of blood, which is roughly 300 mils. Should this be taken off? And the answer is yes, we usually do take this off because we're replacing hemoglobin, not volume. So there's no override actual balance actually required. So for a vast majority of the time, they don't even need to use this. So that takes us to case number 2. This patient develops a large hemorrhage and requires 4 units of blood products and 2 units of normal saline. Should this be taken off? So the answer for that is no, that should not be taken off because we are replacing blood products and we're doing volume expansion. So in order to, you would chart that as you would in the eyes and nose flow sheet, but when you get to the CRRT flow sheet, you would subtract that amount from the actual balance and put it in override actual balance. So let's say you do your time column for that hour for CRRT, and your actual balance says, 1,258, and you know that you gave exactly 1 liter of fluid during this. You would subtract the liter, and you would write 258 in the override actual balance box, and it will take what you had in there before and update it without modifying anything in the eyes and nose flow sheet. So case number 3, the provider orders a large volume paracentesis and they take off 4.5 liters of ascites fluid. Again, in this case, instead of subtracting it from the actual balance, you would add it to. So you'll have a negative actual balance probably. So maybe the negative actual balance says negative 4,300. You would add 4,500 to that, and that would generate 200, and you would write 200 in the override actual balance portion. So this is the only time in CRRT when you actually need to take out your calculator. And honestly, you can still do it in Epic by writing 1,500 minus 500, and it will give you the answer. So pretty rare that you would need to do this for most of our CRRT patients, but it's not unheard of. So that's how to use that feature. There's the answer for that. So that's a lot of words and a lot of slides. So we do a quick steps for success slide here. So step 1 is to chart your intake and output every hour. And it needs to be done 1 hour at a time because each column on the CRRT flow sheet is dependent on the column before it to be done and filed. So if you are coming on shift and your patient has coded and it's just a crazy long day and you have not charted eyes and nose for 7, 8, 9, or 10, you would have to go back and chart 7 o'clock, file, go to your CRRT flow sheet, do the numbers. Go back to your eyes and nose, chart 8 o'clock eyes and nose, file, and then go to your CRRT flow sheet and do the numbers. If you try to do them all at once in either of those boxes, it's going to mess up and it's going to generate incorrect numbers. So step 2 is to put in your hourly UF goal, no negative sign. Don't enter anything if the UF goal is 0 or even. It is understood to be 0. Step 3 is to use your sidebar summary for the hourly intake. Step 4 is to use the flow sheet to calculate your actual balance, and then you are going to decide if it's feasible, because it's often going to suggest something much higher than is possible. So if it suggests 580 mLs of UF, you can't do that. for most patients. So you might decide on, instead of net negative 100 for that hour, you might do net negative 150. And after so many hours of that, you will gradually shrink that suggested fluid removal to just what the goal is. And then, of course, step 5 is to bask in the satisfaction of perfect CRRT charting, which I know is everybody's highest level of success attainment. So that's basically everything. Like I said, I have the Jeopardy slides for you. Did that right as half an hour, so pretty much on time. Resources, again, ICON is that 1-888-404-4266, which spells ICON. The IT Help Desk, of course, is 38586. The CRT SharePoint, you can see that link there. My email and Monica's emails are also on this slide if you have any questions. Thanks for listening, and I hope this serves as a good little educational booster for the 2023 competency season. Have a great day.